The wind pressed hard against the cabin, its voice shrieking through the cracks like a choir of restless ghosts. Evelyn Harrow pulled her shawl tighter, though the wool had long since lost its warmth. At 56, her bones carried winter in them as much as the land did, and the stove's weak glow barely held the frost at bay. She moved with deliberate care, each step echoing the loneliness that clung to the cabin walls. The animals huddled in the barn, the woodpile dwindled, and outside the snowstorm gathered like an enemy waiting to breach her fragile defenses. She had lived through storms before, but this one gnawed at her differently, carrying the sting of years whispered behind her back. Widow, useless, fading. Her white hair, once admired, was now the subject of pitying looks. In town, tongues wagged quick when she passed. Her dignity weighed against the empty space at her table. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm inside her, an endless pounding reminder that she stood alone. A shadow moved in the blizzard. At first, she thought it some trick of her weary eyes, snow whipping against the glass. But then it staggered closer, broad-shouldered, half-cloaked in wind. Her breath caught. A man. No, more like a vision, cut from wilderness itself. Shirtless despite the cruelty of the storm, his skin marked by scars, his hair long and black, whipped wild across his face. He leaned forward as if each step cost him dearly, and for a moment she thought he would vanish, consumed by the snow. Her heart beat hard, the years falling from her like brittle leaves. She unlatched the door, not from reason but from something older, some impulse carved into her bones. The wind rushed in, a fistful of knives, and with it he stumbled across the threshold. His chest heaved, breath ragged, dark eyes heavy with exhaustion yet fierce with life. He smelled of pine smoke and distance, of something untamed. He swayed, nearly falling. Instinct carried her forward, her hands surprisingly steady as she caught his arm. His skin burned with fever, yet he bore the storm's bite with the quiet of a man long used to suffering. She guided him to the chair by the stove, the firelight flaring across the hard planes of his body, each scar a story unsaid. He said nothing, only met her gaze with a silence that unsettled her more than words could. She fetched water, her steps brisk though her breath trembled. "Drink," she whispered, though she wondered if he understood. He did. His hand closed over the cup with surprising gentleness, his fingers calloused, his nails worn. He drank deeply, then lowered his head in the faintest bow, a gesture of respect that felt heavier than speech. Evelyn studied him from the corner of her eye. She knew his kind. Comanche. The town's stories painted them with blood and fire. And yet here sat one before her, broken by storm, not sword. His presence pressed against everything she had been taught to fear, everything the town would condemn if they knew. To shelter him was to invite shame. But to leave him to the snow was to be less than human. The fire licked higher as if sensing the gravity of the moment. He extended his hands toward it, palms scarred, veins rising like rivers. She saw the strength there, the kind that could split wood with one swing, carry burdens she no longer could. And yet she saw weariness too, a weight in his shoulders that matched her own. Hours seemed to slow. The storm howled louder, drumming the roof with fists of ice. Evelyn busied herself with the kettle, the bread scraps, anything to avoid the rising questions within her chest. What had fate brought to her door? Why now, when she had long resigned herself to wither quietly in this cabin forgotten? He spoke at last, his voice low, shaped by an accent roughened on prairie winds. "Let me stay." The word struck her like a bell in the silence. He did not plead. He stated it as a man who had nothing left but dignity. She stiffened, her fingers curling against the table. To take him in was to brand herself further in the eyes of the town. They already whispered that she was strange, cursed, a widow clinging to land she couldn't keep. With him here, their whispers would become knives. She turned, her white hair catching the firelight, and met his eyes again. They were not wild as she expected, but steady, unflinching. She saw hunger there, not just for food or fire, but for belonging. The recognition startled her, for it was the same hunger she carried, hidden beneath layers of years and sorrow. Her breath shook, though her voice came quiet. "The storm will pass. Then you'll go." He didn't answer, only watched her as if her words were another wound he had learned to bear. He shifted in the chair, his broad frame too large for its frail arms, and lowered his gaze to the fire. The silence between them thickened, not with threat, but with something unnamed, dangerous in its tenderness. Outside, the storm raged like judgment itself, snow piling against the door, wind tearing at the world. Inside, two lives balanced in the glow of a dying fire, one marked by age and solitude, the other by exile and scars. Evelyn pressed her palm to the wood of the table, grounding herself against the tremor in her chest. She should send him away. She knew this. But instead she found herself watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the steady strength still present even in exhaustion. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for the shawl draped over a chair. She laid it across his shoulders. For a heartbeat, her fingers brushed his skin, heat meeting frailty, and she felt her shame melt into something sharper, something more alive. He lifted his gaze at that touch, and for the first time his eyes softened. Not gratitude, not plea. Something deeper, a recognition, as if he had been searching through the storm not for shelter, but for her. Evelyn turned away quickly, her breath uneven. The fire popped, sparks scattering like stars against the dark. She pressed her lips tight, fighting the ache rising within her. The storm would end, and with it this fragile moment. She told herself this. She tried to believe it. But the echo of his words lingered, weaving through the howl of wind and the hammer of her heart. Let me stay. And though she had given him no promise, the weight of those words settled deep in her, as if fate itself had crossed her threshold. The storm outside would break by dawn, but Evelyn Harrow knew with a trembling certainty that the storm within her had only just begun. The storm lingered through the night, its voice clawing at the eaves, but dawn brought a muffled hush, the world outside drowned in white. Evelyn Harrow pushed open the door, her breath visible in the brittle air. Snow lay thick across the yard, burying fences, muting every sound. Her frail arms could never cut enough wood to last another week, and she felt the familiar weight of fear pressing into her chest. Yet when she turned back toward the hearth, she saw him rising. Tejo, already gathering himself with the quiet gravity of a man who needed no invitation to act. Without a word, he stepped into the blinding cold, shirtless still, though she draped a woolen coat across his shoulders before he vanished into the drift. The sight startled her, his frame cutting against the storm, broad back bowed against the wind, carrying her axe as if it were an extension of his hand. She watched through the small window as he set to work, the rhythm of his body deliberate, steady, each strike of the blade ringing against silence. Wood split beneath him in clean halves, and soon a pile grew where yesterday there had been only emptiness. Inside, Evelyn's hands trembled as she set the kettle. She had not asked for this, yet something in her bones, long dormant, stirred at the sight of a man laboring for her survival. It frightened her, the way warmth pooled inside her chest, as though her years of widowhood and shame were yielding to a fire she had sworn was extinguished. By midday he returned, arms full of wood, snow clinging to his hair and lashes. He set the bundle beside the stove, shaking himself like some great beast, and the room filled with the scent of pine and the raw sharpness of cold. He glanced at her briefly, eyes lowered, and for the first time she realized the humility with which he carried his strength. He did not expect thanks, nor offer explanation. He only acted, and in acting, kept her world intact. The kettle whistled. Evelyn poured 2 cups of weak coffee, sliding one toward him across the table. His hand dwarfed the mug, but he lifted it carefully, almost reverently, as though the small act carried a weight he understood more deeply than she did. They drank in silence, but the air between them felt changed, less brittle, softened by unspoken recognition. Days passed, and each day unfolded with the same rhythm. Tejo worked without instruction, repairing the roof where ice had gnawed at the shingles, mending the barn door that sagged from neglect, hauling water from the well with an ease that shamed her frail arms. Evelyn found herself moving with new energy, drawn by the pulse of his labor. She cooked small meals from her meager stores, cornbread, beans, thin stew, and though her offerings were humble, the way he accepted them, bowing his head, made them feel like feasts. Yet fear did not leave her. In town, whispers would already be spreading. Smoke from her chimney told the world she was not alone, and Sarah Mae Dawson's tongue was sharp enough to cut flesh. Evelyn imagined the looks, the muttered curses, the condemnation that a white-haired widow had taken a Comanche into her home. Her cheeks burned even in solitude. Shame was a cloak she could never shed, and now it grew heavier with every day he remained. Still, shame faltered in moments. One evening, she returned from feeding the hens to find Tejo crouched by the fire, mending the tear in his trousers with clumsy stitches. His fingers, thick and scarred, struggled with the needle, yet he persisted with patience, brow furrowed in concentration. Something in the sight disarmed her. Without thinking, she crossed the room, took the cloth gently from his hands, and threaded the needle with practiced ease. Their fingers brushed, rough callus against thin skin, and the brief contact sent a current through her she could not name. She stitched in silence, her breath shallow, aware of his eyes fixed not on the garment but on her. When she handed it back, he nodded once, his gaze steady. No words were exchanged, but Evelyn felt as though something had been spoken nonetheless, something heavier than speech, something binding. At night, alone in her narrow bed, she lay awake listening to the quiet creak of the cabin. She thought of the way he moved through the world, not with boast or noise, but with a steadiness that made her own loneliness visible in contrast. She had lived for years shrinking beneath gossip, but this man, exiled from his own people, carried his exile without apology. She envied that strength. She feared it too, for it illuminated how small she had become. The first time she saw him by firelight, shirt open where the mended cloth hung loose, she noticed more than scars. She noticed the way his shoulders caught the glow, the way shadows carved the ridges of his chest. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she turned away quickly, ashamed at herself, ashamed at the traitorous stir of desire in a body she thought had long surrendered such feelings. At her age, desire was supposed to be gone, buried with her husband, dismissed by neighbors who saw only her white hair. Yet here it was, rising unbidden like embers from ash. On the third day, while she drew water, Tejo appeared silently at her side. He took the bucket from her hands, lowering it into the well with one swift motion. The rope groaned, water sloshed, and he pulled it up easily, setting it before her with the dignity of a servant and the strength of a guardian. She murmured thanks, her voice thin, but he only bowed his head slightly, as though gratitude were unnecessary. Still, the way his eyes lingered, steady, unreadable, left her trembling long after he returned to work. That evening, as she set bread on the table, she caught herself humming a tune her husband once loved. The sound startled her, fragile and strange, as if it had belonged to another woman entirely. Tejo paused, listening, his dark gaze softening almost imperceptibly. The tune faltered on her lips, replaced by silence heavy with memory, but the look in his eyes lingered. She felt exposed, seen, and yet for the first time in years not judged. The days grew colder, but the cabin grew warmer, alive with the rhythm of survival. Evelyn felt the edges of herself shift, the boundaries of solitude bending. Fear and shame still pressed at her, but beneath them flickered something else, something she dared not name, yet could not deny. One night, as the fire dwindled and shadows deepened, Tejo spoke again, his voice low, carrying the cadence of stone and wind. "I work. You live." She froze at the simplicity of the words. Not a bargain, not a plea. A truth. Her throat tightened, for she knew the town would see it differently. To them, she was already marked, her dignity unraveling by the hour. Yet in his words lay a promise, that her survival was no longer hers alone to shoulder. Her eyes lifted, catching his across the glow of dying embers. For the briefest moment, her shame fell silent. She saw not exile, not Comanche, not danger. She saw a man who asked nothing, but the chance to build warmth in her winter. The fire cracked sharply, startling her. She looked away quickly, gathering her shawl, but the echo of his words lingered like heat in her chest. She told herself she would send him away when the snow melted, when tongues grew too sharp, when shame grew too heavy. But deep down, Evelyn Harrow knew something had already shifted. The storm outside had passed, but the one within her heart was only gathering strength. The thaw did not come, but whispers did. Evelyn Harrow felt them before she heard them, as though the snow itself carried judgment down from town and pressed it against her door. On the rare days she walked to the mercantile for flour or beans, eyes followed her like hawks. Sarah Mae Dawson, with her bright shawl and sharper tongue, let her words float just loud enough. Strange smoke at the widow's cabin. Strange tracks in the snow. Strange how she looks less worn these days. The laughter that followed stung worse than frostbite. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, though inside she shrank. Back home, silence wrapped the cabin, but silence was no refuge. It left her alone with shame, with the memory of glances that clung to her like burrs. She touched her white hair, smoothing it, though nothing could hide its brightness. She felt exposed, as if her age itself were scandal. And yet, each time she opened the door and saw Tejo bent over the fence, his broad back steady against the cold, she felt something else, a stubborn defiance rising through her shame. He did not bend beneath gossip. He did not even acknowledge it. His quiet was stronger than any town decree. One evening, she found him sharpening the axe by lantern glow. Sparks flew with each stroke, casting brief fire across his face. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "They say I've lost my mind," she murmured. He did not pause, only lifted his gaze to hers, dark and calm. "You listen." She flinched, for the question cut deeper than reproach. She wanted to say no, that she stood untouched. But the truth ached in her bones. She listened too much, had always listened, until their words shaped her like cold wind against stone. She looked away, ashamed. Tejo set down the whetstone, rising to his full height. In the narrow space of the cabin, he seemed to fill it entirely, yet his presence was not a threat but a shield. He touched the scar along his ribs, a pale mark against his skin. "They send me away," he said quietly. The words were simple, but she felt their weight, the exile carried in his silence. "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His eyes drifted to the fire, its flames dancing like restless spirits. "They wanted cruelty. I wanted, no." The pause was heavy, but it spoke enough. He had refused some act of savagery, and the cost had been his belonging. Something in her shifted. She saw not only strength in him but wounds, not only power but refusal. He bore scars of both body and soul, and in them she glimpsed her own reflection. Widowhood had exiled her in another way, cast out from laughter, from touch, from the possibility of desire. She whispered, "We are both left outside." The words startled her, for she had not spoken of her loneliness in years. His gaze met hers then, and in it was no judgment, only recognition. The following days deepened their unspoken bond. He worked, she cooked, they lived in rhythms that spoke louder than conversation. Yet town eyes grew harsher. Marshal Boone Carver rode out once, his horse stamping frost near her gate. "You're stirring trouble, Evelyn," he warned, his voice low. "The town won't stomach it. Best send him on his way." She held the railing of the porch tightly, every joint stiff with dread. She wanted to say she had no choice, that the storm had brought him, that she would send him off soon. But behind her, she felt Tejo's presence, steady and unyielding, and her throat closed on the lie. She only nodded, lips pressed tight, while the marshal turned and rode away with eyes sharp as knives. That night, Evelyn sat long at the table, hands folded, staring at the flame. "They'll take everything from me," she whispered. Tejo sat across from her, silent, carving a piece of wood with his knife. His hands moved slowly, shaping a form she could not yet see. Finally, he set it before her, a small bird, rough but tender in its lines. "They cannot take this," he said simply. She touched the carving, her chest swelling with something perilous. Hope. Yet fear remained. When two men from town came stumbling drunken through the snow, jeering outside her cabin, Evelyn felt terror curl in her stomach. "Widow keeps company with savages." One shouted, their laughter cruel in the night. She shrank back, trembling, until Tejo opened the door. He did not raise his voice, nor reach for weapon. He only stood, tall and bare-chested against the cold, eyes burning with quiet fire. The men faltered, their bravado crumbling under the weight of his silence. After a long, tense moment, they spat curses and retreated into the dark. Evelyn's knees weakened with relief. She whispered, "Why didn't you fight?" His answer was steady. To fight is to prove them right. Her shame cracked that night, a fissure opening where light might enter. She had always believed her dignity tied to town approval, to whispers softened into silence. But in his restraint she saw another truth. Dignity could be born in refusal, in silence, in standing when others tried to topple you. Later, she brought a quilt to where he lay near the fire. Her hand brushed his shoulder as she draped it over him, and he caught her wrist gently, not holding, only pausing. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time she felt no shame at being seen. Not as an old widow, not as a woman diminished, but as Evelyn, whole and trembling and alive. She pulled back, heart racing, retreating to her room. Yet the warmth of that touch lingered long into the night. Sleep eluded her. She thought of his scars, of his exile, of the bird he carved from mere scrap, fragile and enduring. She thought of her own years, of love buried, of dignity stolen by whispers. The two seemed bound by the same thread. Wounds turned into silence, silence turned into survival. Before dawn, she rose and stared at her reflection in the warped mirror. The white hair, the lines at her mouth, the shadows beneath her eyes. Signs of a life weathered, but not extinguished. She pressed her palm to the glass, as though to remind herself she was still flesh, still here. When she stepped into the main room, he was already awake, feeding logs to the fire. The flames leapt higher, chasing the shadows from the walls. She stood watching him, the warmth curling into her chest. The words came before she could think better. "If they come again," her voice faltered. He turned, eyes meeting hers steadily. She finished in a whisper, "Don't leave." The silence stretched, heavy with the risk of it. He said nothing, only inclined his head once, the promise carved into the gesture. Evelyn's breath trembled, for she knew in that moment that her survival was no longer just her own. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet as ash, cloaking the land in judgment and grace alike. Inside, Evelyn felt the weight of choice gathering, heavy as the storm. For the first time in years, she feared not the winter, but the moment she would have to face the town. Morning broke with a brittle stillness, the snow crusted over like glass beneath Evelyn's boots. She walked the path into town with her shawl drawn close, each step measured, her heart a stone shifting against her ribs. The streets were quiet but not empty. Eyes flickered from porches and windows, whispers coiled in her wake. Sarah May's voice, sharp as ever, drifted across the street. "White hair don't keep her pure. Some storms leave dirt behind." Laughter followed, but Evelyn did not falter. Her chin remained lifted, though her cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the weak sun. Inside the mercantile, she kept her hands steady as she gathered flour and lard, but every scrape of boots on the wooden floor, every hushed murmur, pressed against her like the weight of years. She heard her name hissed once, twice. Widow Harrow. Savage's woman. She felt herself shrinking, but then she remembered Tejo's silence the night of the drunken jeers, the way he had stood unyielding without drawing blood. That image lodged in her chest like an ember refusing to die. She straightened her shoulders, let her white hair fall loose, and paid with exact change, meeting the shopkeeper's wary eyes without flinching. When she stepped back into the cold, the sky split with light through thinning clouds, and for a moment she felt it touch her face like a benediction. Shame still clung, but beneath it pulsed something stubborn. Dignity. She walked home faster, not to flee, but to return to the one place where silence had begun to turn into belonging. At the cabin, she found Tejo mending the gate. His shirt hung open where she had stitched it, the fabric pulling taut across his chest with each movement. Sawdust clung to his hair, and sweat traced lines through the grit on his skin. He looked up as she approached, not with question or claim, only with the steady acknowledgement that had come to anchor her. For the first time, she did not look away. She met his gaze, her breath clouding in the cold air, and in that shared moment she felt her shame loosen, if only slightly, from its grip. The days pressed forward. Tejo labored, Evelyn tended, and the land began to show the shape of their combined hands. The barn stood straighter, the fences held firm, and the hearth burned warmer. Evelyn moved through her days with a pace unfamiliar in years, purpose guiding her limbs, not just survival. Each evening she found herself lingering by the fire a little longer, drawn by the quiet strength of his presence. When her hands brushed his in the passing of bread or coffee, she did not retreat so quickly. She allowed the tremor of life to rise through her fingers, let it remind her she was not yet finished. Mrs. Prudence Whitlock visited one afternoon, her step slow but her eyes kind. She brought a jar of preserves, setting it firmly on the table before Evelyn could protest. "They talk in town," she said softly. "But I've learned long ago, gossip rots faster than apples left out. What matters is if a woman can look at herself in the mirror, and not bow her head." Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to ask if she herself still could, but the words would not form. Mrs. Whitlock patted her hand gently, her touch like sunlight across frost, and left without another word. Evelyn stood long after, the weight of that mercy bending her knees and lifting her spirit in the same breath. That night, Evelyn looked into the warped mirror once more. The face staring back bore lines of sorrow, but in the firelight her white hair gleamed not as a curse but as a crown. For the first time, she did not reach to hide it. She let it fall untamed and whispered to her reflection, "You are still here." Tejo entered quietly then, setting down the axe. His eyes caught her in that unguarded state, and though shame pricked at her, she held his gaze. He moved no closer, only placed a hand on the doorframe he had repaired days before, his fingers resting against the wood as if sealing the space they now shared. Evelyn felt the gesture more deeply than any words could reach. It was not claim nor command, but a vow of presence. The nights grew colder, yet Evelyn's heart grew warmer. She found herself humming again as she stirred pots, found herself standing taller when she crossed the yard. When gossip drifted across her thoughts, it did not hollow her as before. Instead, she recalled the strength of his silence, the kindness of Mrs. Whitlock, the dignity of her own reflection. Still, fear lingered. She knew the town's patience wore thin. Marshal Boone Carver rode by once more, his gaze stern as he slowed his horse near her fence. "The council's talking," he warned. "Sheltering him means losing your land. Don't test them, Evelyn." His words struck cold, but Evelyn did not cower. She stood on her porch, hands clasped, white hair blowing in the wind, and answered softly, "It's my land and I'll decide who keeps its fire burning." For a moment, surprise flickered across the marshal's face before it hardened again. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her heart pounding with both terror and pride. That evening, she sat by the fire, trembling from the confrontation. Tejo noticed, though he said nothing. He only reached for another log, feeding the flame until the room glowed brighter. Evelyn watched him, her fear mingling with gratitude, until tears stung her eyes. She turned away quickly, ashamed of her weakness, but then she felt his presence near. He placed the carved bird, now smoothed, its wings more defined, gently on the table beside her. She traced its outline with shaking fingers. "Why give this to me?" she whispered. His answer came low. "Because you look at me, not away." The words pierced her, not with pain but with a strange, tender power. She realized then that dignity was not granted by others, nor stolen by gossip. It was stirred awake by recognition, by refusing to bow her head when life pressed her low. In Tejo's silence, in his labor, in his refusal to see her as diminished, she found the seed of her own rising. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting their shadows together, larger than the room itself. Evelyn closed her eyes, breathing deeply, the weight of shame loosening further. She did not know if she could bear the town's wrath, but she knew she could no longer hide from herself. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of hooves. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her chest tightening. She moved to the window, parting the frost-laced glass. In the distance, lanterns bobbed like fireflies across the snow, too many to be chance riders. The council had come, not with whispers this time, but with judgment made flesh. Her hand gripped the sill, her knuckles white. Behind her, Tejo rose silently, his presence steady as a mountain. Evelyn's breath quivered, yet her chin lifted, the ember of dignity burning into flame. For the first time in years, she felt ready to face what came. The lanterns drew closer, their glow trembling across the snow like a string of fire dragged through the dark. Evelyn Harrow stood at her window, her breath fogging the glass, her heart a restless drum in her chest. She counted the figures, half a dozen men, maybe more, mounted, cloaked against the cold, their horses' breaths steaming in the frozen night. Judgment had left the safety of whispers. It now came carrying iron and law. Behind her, Tejo rose from the fire, the carved bird still on the table where he had left it. He did not ask, did not speak. He only stood tall, silent as the land itself, his bare chest glinting with firelight. Evelyn turned to him, fear twisting through her bones, but also something stronger, an ember that had grown over weeks into flame. For years she had bowed beneath shame, letting the town define her, reduce her to a widow with white hair and no use. But tonight, with the storm still heavy on the air, and the council riding hard toward her door, she felt a clarity that stole her breath. The horses stopped at her gate. Voices carried through the wind. Marshal Boone Carver called first, steady, sharp. "Evelyn Harrow, open your door. We won't ask twice." She gripped the latch, her hand trembling, then steadied it with a slow breath. Tejo stepped closer, his presence filling the small space, but he did not reach for weapon or word. She met his eyes, dark and unflinching, and in them she read what she had come to trust. He would follow her lead. The choice was hers. She opened the door. The cold swept in, carrying the smell of horses and iron, the glint of lantern light on rifles. The men sat high in their saddles, breath puffing, faces set hard. Boone Carver sat at the front, his coat collar turned up, his hand on the reins. His gaze landed on her, then slid past to the figure looming in the shadows behind her. "So it's true," he said. "You've kept him here." Her shawl whipped in the wind, white hair spilling free, but she lifted her chin. "I have." Her voice wavered once, then steadied. "And I will." A murmur rippled through the men. Sarah May's husband spat into the snow. "You shame yourself, Evelyn. You shame us all." Evelyn's hands curled tight, her pulse quickening. Once, she would have shrunk. Once, she would have bowed her head and begged forgiveness for sins she had not committed. But not tonight. Tonight she felt Tejo's silent strength behind her, the bird he had carved still resting on her table, the fire burning with more than wood. She stepped forward, onto the porch, and let her voice carry. "Shame," she said, "is turning a woman's hair against her. Shame is gossip sharper than hunger. Shame is leaving a man to freeze in the snow because of where he was born. If that is the dignity of this town, then I want no part of it." Her words fell into the night like stones into still water. Boone's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. The others shifted uneasily, their rifles no longer aimed but resting heavy in their hands. One of them, younger, uncertain, muttered, "He's dangerous. He's one of them." Tejo stepped into the doorway then, silent as always, but his presence struck harder than any shout. He did not brandish steel. He did not bare teeth. He stood with the calm of a mountain, broad shoulders squared, his gaze level. Then, without a word, he walked past Evelyn, into the snow. The men tensed, rifles half-raised, but he did not advance. Instead, he crossed to the pile of logs near the gate, lifted one, and split it clean with a single stroke of the axe. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and final. He split another and another, the rhythm steady, unhurried. Each strike said more than any defense. "I am not here to destroy. I am here to build." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow itself. Evelyn's chest swelled, her eyes stung. She stepped down from the porch, standing beside him, her boots sinking into the drift. Together they faced the council. She touched the split log, warm from his hand, and let her voice rise once more. "You call him danger," she said, "but he is the reason my fire still burns. You call me shameful, but I call myself alive. If you want my land for that, then take it. But I will not send him away." Her words rang out, trembling but resolute, and for the first time in years she felt taller than the men before her. She felt her dignity not as something granted by others but as something carved within her, like the bird on her table, shaped by scar and silence. Boone's eyes softened, just barely. He studied her, then the man beside her, then the snow stretching endless behind them. Finally, he exhaled, the cloud of his breath mingling with the storm. "The council won't like it," he said. "But maybe it's not our liking that matters." He turned his horse with a jerk of the reins. The others hesitated, grumbled, spat curses under their breath, but one by one they followed him, lanterns dwindling into the dark until only the storm remained. Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle, but she held herself upright. Tejo lowered the axe, his chest rising steady, his silence as sure as stone. She looked at him, her heart a storm of fear and relief, shame and pride, and for once she did not turn away. He met her gaze, the snow swirling between them, and after a long moment he spoke, his voice low, raw. "Let me give you life again." Her breath caught. The words struck deep, not as plea but as promise. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as it found his. The contact was simple, but it carried all that had been denied her: touch, belonging, the right to feel herself more than rumor. Tears blurred her sight, hot against the cold. She did not answer in words. Her fingers closed around his, and that was enough. The storm howled on, yet inside her a stillness bloomed. For the first time in years, Evelyn Harrow felt not exiled but chosen. She had stood before the council and kept her dignity. She had chosen not shame but life. And in the silent strength of the man beside her, she felt the future crack open like a log under the swing of an axe, splintered, raw, but ready to burn. Later, when the fire roared high and the cabin filled with warmth, Evelyn sat beside Tejo, her hand still in his, the carved bird resting on the table between them. She looked at the flames, their light dancing across the walls, and knew the truth she had long denied. Love did not arrive with youth alone. It came with courage, with survival, with the quiet defiance of two souls who refused to bow. And to the listener, the old soul whispering this tale across time, the lesson holds. Dignity is not granted by the crowd, nor stolen by their whispers. It lives in the moments when we stand, trembling yet unbroken, beside the ones who see us whole.